Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session in our Greenberg series on managing renewable energy and e-mobility, leading the race to zero. My name is Rolf Ustenhagen. I'm a professor for management of renewable energies here at the University of St.Gallen, and together with my team, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this series. Today we'll have the first webinar moderated by Jakob Knauf on the topic of power to the people, citizen co-investment in the energy transition. And this is the first of 5 webinars in a weekly series that we will have on a variety of topics related to managing renewable energy and e-mobility. It's a particular pleasure to welcome also some of the alumni of our executive education program in renewable energy management, as well as some of the students in our Managing Climate Solutions certificate here at the University of St.Gallen. I will hand it over to Jakob in just a minute to introduce today's topic. Just a bit of housekeeping. We would invite you to switch your camera off while we have the input presentations, and then switch it on if you would like to ask a question. You can ask your questions later on, either directly on camera, or you can also put your questions in the chat. And then in the last part of the webinar today, we will pick up on those questions and engage with the speakers on this. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Jakob Knauf and introduce the topic of today's webinar. Jakob.
Thank you very much, Rolf. Yeah, today's topic, power to the people, citizens co-investment in the energy transition. Welcome to everyone. My name is Jakob Knauf. I'm a researcher here at IWÖ, and I'm also part of the Mistral project, which focuses on the acceptance or social acceptance of renewable energies. And in particular, my topic is co-investment. So my research fits very well what we talk about today. And I'm really happy that we have 2 guest speakers today, who I will introduce just in a second. I will also show some of my research results, but that's just on the side. From the logistics, we will start with with my introduction, and then we have some input presentations, and in the end we will have time for some questions and answers. The webinar is recorded, so please be aware of this if you, for example, switch on your camera and your microphone if you ask some questions later. As I said, I'm from the University of St.Gallen, and I will talk about wind energy today. And we have Roger Langenegger, who is from Solarify. He will talk about crowdfunding with solar energy. And we have Dr. Arwen, who will talk about how citizens in Berlin wants to get back the grid, that has, let's say, a community grid system. Stefan Garens, he will moderate the chat, and so if you have any questions, and you can ask them in the chat, he will watch them, and later then in the Q&A session we'll read the questions. But you also, of course, have the possibility later just to use your microphone or your camera. The agenda is, I will talk about, as I said, about co-investments in German wind energy projects. So that's a perspective from Germany. Then we have a perspective from Switzerland with online PV crowdfunding initiatives. And as I said, with the power grid, why do you want to buy your power grid? Trust me, you do. So my research is a lot about Germany and also how wind energy is developing there. And one point which is really critical there are co-investments. What's the background? Well, one of the main issues why we have co-investments is basically based on the aim to increase the share of renewable energies in the German energy mix. You can see on the left side some numbers from the Klimaschutzprogramm from the German government, and basically it says that until 2050, the idea is that 80% of the renewable electricity should be renewable. One main source of renewable electricity is wind energy, and especially, for example, onshore. And here you can see on the right side how much new installations of wind energy are there in the past 20 years. You can see it varies a lot, but like after 2010, it looked like that we have a lot of acceleration and there's more and more wind energy. So we were actually in a good way to achieve the aims concerning renewable energy in the German electricity mix. But then afterwards, like after some years, around 2017, the number of new installations decreased a lot. There are many reasons, but one of the reasons is that the planning processes became longer and longer. And basically we see some resistance towards these turbines, which is not only in Germany, but also in Switzerland. The whole time, the idea of this, well, what can we do actually? And one possibility was to offer financial incentives. You can see here some from articles or some captions from newspaper articles starting 2015, so rather old newspaper articles, and having one from last year. So it was always a long time in the political discussion over the years, and for a long time not much happened. But then at the end of last year, the politicians in the national German government decided to make some changes to the German Renewable Energy Act. And now voluntary payments for up to 0.2 cent per kilowatt hour are allowed to the municipality. So the project developer who's developing the project can pay this to the municipality. This doesn't sound like a lot, but it is around 20,000 euros per wind turbine in year to the municipality, and especially when the municipality is rather small, or also when where there's not much industry, this can be a lot of money. The basic idea, why do we do this? Well, literature also has analyzed it, or recent scientific literature, and the idea is that financial participation has an effect that on distributive justice, which basically states that, well, all this infrastructure, streets, renewable energies and other infrastructures, they have some benefits and some costs. And well, these renewable energy generation facilities as wind energy, they of course produce electricity, and there are some revenues. And the idea is, well, we have these wind turbines around at the community, but if then the citizens can participate in these revenues, then they do not only have the costs, so the wind turbines next to their homes, but they also have some benefits. And when this cost and benefits are shared, then this can increase community acceptance. So financial participation overall has a positive effect on distributive justice, and this can have a positive effect on community acceptance. But there are also many other reasons why this is offered in Germany. For example, project funding. I think we will hear a lot more about it in the next presentation. So it's about how do we finance these renewable energy and generation facilities. Also, customer loyalty is a point, for example, for public utilities who want to make sure that, which is relevant in Germany, where people can change their electricity provider. So when they have some special offers for their customers, this can help to keep the customers loyal. But also securing land is a big issue. For example, in Germany, there's not so much land anymore available for developing. And this can be an argument if the project developer says, I'm going to offer financial participation, then some municipalities are more likely to give the land to the people, to the developer. Before we go too deep into the co-investments, and I also mentioned already several terms: financial participation, community benefit schemes, and also we have co-investments. I want to give you a short overview of it because I think that's really important for the discussion later on. On the left side, you can see the community benefit schemes, which basically states that the owner of the renewable energy generation facility gives or provides some money or shares the revenues with someone else. For example, the community directly, so the people, or it can be the municipality, or it can be also some other projects, for example, social purposes like a kindergarten. So the citizens there, they do not get directly involved in this. And that's why this is today not what we are talking about, but that was, for example, decided by the German national government. this system. So the wind energy developer can just give some money to the municipality. But there's another very nice way how citizens can be involved, and that's on the right side, when citizens invest their own money, for example, here in the wind turbine, and then they receive some returns. And here we find basically two different ways. We have the equity and debt models, which we will also talk about today. Here, just some idea from Germany. Basically, for example, for co-investment models in wind energy, there you can see that there are preferences for different parts of Germany. For example, we have in equity, we have some in the north of Germany, this is preferred, while we see in some eastern parts of Germany that, for example, debt is preferred. And equity and cooperative is connected with shareholder rights, but also obligations. And on the other hand, with the debt financing, or the developer remains the owner and also has the flexibility. In my research, I was interested, why do we have these different models and when is which model preferred? And my original idea is, or was when I started, I thought, well, this equity is quite interesting because it actually gives the citizens much more power than when you think of debts. So what I assumed first is that equity is increasing social acceptance most because citizens have they have more to say than when they only invest their money with debt financing. On the other hand, it's different for project initiator. They of course have more freedom when they just give some loans out, and if they also give ownership rights to someone else, their power is somehow decreasing. What I found in my research is that there are good reasons for both of these models. And one big plus of this debt financing is that it's quite familiar to people and to citizens. So the loan is something that people know, they know how it works. And this can really help actually to persuade people to invest in this turbine, to become active. While with equity, it's much more complicated, and this is might be a little bit threatening to people. We have also the flexibility of involvement. A loan can be in the beginning, but also after the project is already operating. And that is what we see very often in Germany with wind energy projects. The turbine is already there and it's operating, it's working, people can see it's producing energy, and they can just then invest, and it's quite safe investment at this point. On the other hand, with the equity financing, it requires really people that they want to participate. Because, like as I said, it's much more effort to do. And if we are all busy somehow, and when you think about, you have many different responsibilities, and then having this additional responsibility, it can be a burden. Of course, it is, you have more to say, but you also have then more to do. The risk of loss is often much higher because usually this equity you have to give at the early stage of a project, and where you don't know is this project going to be successful or not. So the risk is much higher, but also of course the return in the end. But still, it depends really how's your feeling of risks. Are you someone who is willing to take this risk or not? And it can be, of course, an argument again for some loans which have rather low risks. And we have, as I said already, the complexity of involvement. This is much lower when you just give a loan, and but if you buy shares, this complexity is much higher. Thank you very much for this. Was a short introduction to wind energy, and I now will stop sharing the screen, and I invite Roger Langenegger to share his screen and to tell us something about crowdfunding in Switzerland and PV.
Okay, so I'll try to share my screen now. So can everyone see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jakob. As mentioned, my name is Roger Langenegger. I'm working as a solar crowdfunding project developer at Solarify. And I'm very pleased to give you some insights into the solar co-investment landscape here in Switzerland in the next minutes. So first, I would like to present you some different forms of solar co-investment opportunities here in Switzerland, and then refer to our platform Solarify as one example for a Swiss-wide solar crowdfunding platform. Then I'd like to resume to present some motivations which are frequently brought up in the scientific literature about the topic, and conclude with some drivers and barriers of this sector. Well, what does citizen co-investment mean? We already heard or became some ideas in Jakob's presentation, but it's basically a financial participation scheme which allows private individuals with no professional investment background to co-finance renewable energy projects, for example. And actually in Switzerland, co-financing energy projects have quite a long-standing tradition, usually traditional form of energy cooperatives. In an energy cooperatives, private individuals become member of the cooperative. They through buying cooperative certificates, and thus provide capital to the cooperative, which is then invested into designated projects. More recent form is online renewable energy crowdfunding through online crowdfunding platforms. And that was also the main focus of my master thesis. That's also why the next couple of slides will be more focused on this online crowdfunding participation scheme. Such platforms have emerged all over Europe. For example, as an example, the Swedish platform Trine, the German platforms Better West or Ecoligo, or our platform Solarify here in Switzerland. In my master thesis, I was actually quite thrilled to see which diversity of crowdfunding initiatives is available in Switzerland in the solar sector. In total, I found 38 different initiatives, some operating at a very local level, on the municipality level, other even internationally. So it's quite heterogeneous, it's quite diverse, it's very creative. And for example, on this map here, every blue dot you see is one electricity utility company, which provides crowdfunding, PV solar crowdfunding projects within their grid area. So as a customer, you can buy, let's say, a square meter of a PV installation of the utility, and you're then rewarded with some electricity discounts, or you get solar electricity, which is then discounted from your electricity bill. Then red dots are private initiatives, the brown ones like the ones in Lake Geneva area, cities and municipalities, which sometimes use donation-based crowdfunding schemes even. And lastly, yellow dots are association or special cooperatives, which also use online crowdfunding schemes. Besides that, there will be about 288 other energy cooperatives which manage PV installations in Switzerland. But that would have gone beyond the scope of my thesis to assess them all, and there's also quite some literature on them too. This graph illustrates that it's quite a recent and quite a fast-growing niche in the energy sector, and this recent growth was mainly due to different utility companies which also launched crowdfunding offers within their grid area. Well, one example for a private initiative is our platform Solarify, through which we could already implement quite a bunch of different projects on different building types and in all parts of Switzerland. So how does our model work? We recognize that nationwide there are thousands of unused roof spaces, and on the other side there are thousands of private individuals with some savings. Savings they don't really want to invest on the stock market or in investment funds, but rather in very specific projects which are in line with their values. And we as a company, we connect those two players. So we design the PV installations, which are then presented to the crowd, and small-scale investors then finance the project by buying single solar panels of the installation. And once it's financed, we install them, and once they operate, we sell the electricity to the building owner and to the utility company, actually in the name of the owners of the panels, so the small-scale investors. So the roof owner or the building owner benefits from a roof rent, or gets the solar electricity cheaper than the electricity product he purchases from the grid. From the revenues created, 80% flow to the small-scale investors and 20% stays with Solarify for the services provided. And with this 80%, the small-scale investors obtain a yearly profit of about 2 to 3%. With this model, we could already implement quite some projects. We now sold about 4,200 solar panels to nearly 700 small-scale investors, which in total invested about 3.7 million Swiss francs into our installations. Yesterday was quite a special day because we commissioned our 27th installation, which means that we now hit the 1 megawatt of installed solar capacity mark, which was quite a milestone. And we're quite happy that we will hit the 2 megawatts mark quite soon, because currently we're financing other projects with about almost 900 kilowatt peak of power. Also, thanks to these partnerships that we could establish over the last years. So if you want to become a solar electricity producer yourself, it couldn't be easier than just going on our platform, choose your favorite project, choose the desired amount of panels, and done. The rest will be ensured by us. So in the scientific literature, this topic of citizen co-investment into the solar sector was quite debated over the last years. And one central theme was what motivates private individuals to actually contribute or to invest into such offer. And it's quite interesting because it's way more than just a conventional risk-return consideration, but rather quite a heterogeneous and diverse set of motivations, personal preferences, and values, which influence the investment decision. So frequently named are, for example, contributing to a decentralized, renewable and nuclear-free energy system, to contribute to environmental protection and climate change mitigation, decrease reliance on electricity import, but also to obtain a positive financial return through the investment. Also mentioned sometimes is to support local initiatives and to create value locally. So in this sense, solar crowdfunding can be seen as what is called an impact investment. So an impact investment is an investment which creates measurable positive societal impact and at the same time still delivers a positive financial return to the ones that invested in such projects. Lastly, to name just a few, I think this list is far from being complete. I think some of the most important drivers is that in Switzerland we're in this privileged situation that a large number of citizens have a savings account with savings they want actually, or they're willing to invest into such initiatives. Then PV, so solar, as it produces electricity which can be marketed. Such projects are profitable, at least to a certain degree. So investing into such projects and obtaining a positive financial return is possible. And I think maybe most importantly, such offers or such platforms usually do not fall under the regulation of the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, the FINMA. So it's not a requirement to have a banking license to offer such crowdfunding schemes. On the barrier side, I think it's to mention that PV projects in Switzerland have a very long payback period. So such small scale investors need to be willing to invest long term, which is not everyone's favorite, let's say. So we're talking about usually periods of 20 to 30 years. And secondly, the energy market in Switzerland is only partly liberalized, which still limits the diversity of business models which is possible in Switzerland. So yeah, that's it from my side. I'm very happy to answer your questions then later on in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can put them now in the chat or later on. Yeah, Roger, you're still sharing your screen. Yes, thank you very much. And yeah, I also have some questions already wrote it down, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. But before that, I would like to hand over the microphone to Arwen. I see you're already sharing your screen. Thank you very much. So you can start when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me and having me. It's great to be here. My name is Arwen Cowell. I am a co-founder of a cooperative in Berlin called BürgerEnergie Berlin. So I want to talk to you today about why you should all want to buy your low voltage power grid. But I'm also a social scientist focusing on the energy transition and the transition in the sustainability transition in the transport sector. So I kind of have two hats, one being involved immediately in economic and citizen-led processes around the energy transition, but also focusing on that in my research. So the title of my presentation is obviously slightly provocative, but I do think, or I do hope by the end of this session, you will want to buy not just solar panels, although I do think it's a great model that Solarify is offering, but also be invested more directly in the distribution, in the infrastructure of distribution in the energy system. And I want to talk briefly about why this is the case. So wherever you turn, and this is obviously something that both Jakob and Roger have already touched upon, we do need to speed things up in terms of our shift to renewable energies, and we have huge challenges ahead. So if we look at Berlin alone, which is the city where I'm based, the grid operator will have to connect at least the amount of PV generation every single year from now on that was installed over the past 25 years. So we need to be considerably faster in terms of both building renewable energy generation, but also connecting it to the grid, because once it's built, it then needs to be connected to the grid, and this comes with quite unique challenges in addition to installing generation capacity. This is a grid challenge at all levels, and we are very much used to talking about challenges at the level that you see here, the transmission grid, this idea of saying, well, if we have large quantities of renewable energies pushing into the grid, how do we get them from where they are generated? For example, in Germany, that is typically discussed in terms of offshore wind energy generation, but also large onshore wind energy generation. How do we get it from those places that are very intensive in terms of what they can produce to the centers of demand, which are typically not located where we have lots of space for renewable energy production. But actually the low voltage level is where the magic happens in the energy transition. And that touches also upon what Roger has talked about, because PV installations feed directly into the low voltage grid. But the low voltage power grid is not used to this kind of bidirectionality, because traditionally it was designed as the last mile in the grid, connecting large centralized, often fossil fuel structures to consumers. So it's the last sort of line, just sending energy one way. And now that it has to integrate renewable energy generation, it has to balance supply and demand at all times, because the power grid cannot store energy itself. It can only ever have as much energy in the grid, which can also be distributed at the time. So it needs to integrate fluctuating generation, and it has to become much more flexible in terms of managing the demand side and moving around how we consume energy, both at the individual, the household level, but also obviously in commercial and industrial settings. But this is also a social challenge, and it's an opportunity, because not only the energy generation, but also the fact that we have to think about how we distribute energy opens up new and increased ways of participation, economically as well as civically. So being a presumer, and this idea of saying I'm not just consuming energy passively, I'm not just flicking my light switch and the light comes on, but I might actually be able to shift my consumption. For example, I'm going to run my washer dryer whenever the sun is shining. I'm going to allow the grid operator to charge my electric vehicle, maybe in a way that serves as grid, or is opening up new roles in the energy system, just as the idea of investing in renewable energy generation opens up new roles, obviously, for citizens that previously didn't exist in the energy system. And what is really important to me here to make this point is to say we have obviously technological innovations that shape the energy transitions, but social innovations just as much matter in terms of how we manage to not only accelerate, but then also successfully implement the energy transition. So this idea of how do we organize ownership, how do we invest, and who is allowed to make decisions, not only on the shape of the energy system, but also on the way that revenues are distributed, is really important to the way that we implement the energy transition. So why does grid ownership matter? I already said this relates importantly to the question of grid connection. So again, if we look at the case of Berlin, we can see that, and I'm sorry that this graph is in German, but the important thing to focus on is the orange line outside the circle to say this is the amount of rooftops that's in private hands in Berlin. So if we want to solarify the city, if we want to install PV on all those rooftops, we have to do that on privately owned rooftops, and the grid operator has to work with every single one of these projects to ensure grid connection and integration of these generating capacities. And this is obviously not only true for Berlin, but really true for the whole energy system. So cooperative ownership of the grid, the idea to say, well, if we are involved in energy generation, then we should also be involved in grid connection, links grid operations to the social perspective. So this includes obviously the customer view, but more importantly, it includes the community view, this idea of saying, well, we want this thing to go forward. We want grid connections to be fast. We want the grid operator to invite as much renewable energy as possible, and we want them to work with these private households, every single one of them, to make sure that this works. And that's why we need a shift of perspective at the level of the grid operator. So what do we do? And this is essentially a brief history of our cooperative. We were established in 2011. Incredibly, it's been a very long time. And the idea really was to say, well, we want co-ownership of the distribution grid, because we can see that we don't have enough speed in the energy transition in Berlin. And we're not going to go into every single one of those steps because you can have the slides afterwards and go into the details of our story, but I want to rather point out a couple of important steps. So we entered the application process to become the grid operator in Berlin, which is called a Konzession. A concession, which governs the right to own and operate the power grid, because the power grid is obviously a monopoly. And we entered that application process to say we want to team up with public ownership. We want the Land Berlin to municipalize grid management, and we want the cooperative, a citizen-owned cooperative, to be a partner of the municipality in owning and operating the grid. It took a very long time to convince the political powers that be that it might not be very dangerous to work with citizens, but it might actually be an incredible opportunity, because we bring knowledge, we bring the idea of social support and community connection, but we also bring money. So it's also interesting financially. But in September 2016, the then newly elected Red-Red-Green coalition governing the city committed to remunicipalizing the grids in its coalition agreement, and said we also want to work with the cooperative. We want co-ownership of the cooperative. In March 2019, the concession was finally assigned, and municipalization was initialized. And although this was fought in the courts for a while, Early this year, actually, we finally had the decision of the Senate and the Abgeordnetenhaus, the Berlin Parliament, to buy the power grid, based on also an offer of Vattenfall to say, okay, we're going to sell the power grid to you. And we then had the fastest due diligence in the history of public ownership in Berlin, because by July, they had actually bought the power grid. And we are still waiting for them to follow through on their promise of co-ownership, but we were allowed to, in a first step, send one member name one member of the administrative board of the new municipally owned grid operator, which already includes one of the pillars that we want to work on, the ability to make decisions on strategic decisions on grid management. So what are our key arguments as a cooperative? Like I said, the first key pillar is to say we want to be involved in decision-making on the energy transition in the city. We want to co-invest. We want to be part of the economic transition in the city, and we want the implementation of renewable energies to speed up. And we don't want to leave this to the municipality alone, but rather we want to work with the municipality. And a key reason for this is that if the municipality owns the grid, revenues are municipalized, they become part of the public household, which is not a bad thing, but they cannot be tied to investments in renewable energy. They can with a cooperative. So the cooperative can make sure that revenues are redirected directly into energy system change. And we currently have over 3,000 supporters as members and trustees involved with the cooperative. The idea of the cooperative, and this is actually one of our general assemblies before we had to make them digital due to COVID, is to say one member, one vote, independent of the number of financial shares. And we're an equal rights community. So everybody has the same right to speak and everybody casts the same vote, regardless of their financial prowess. We're an economic actor. That means we go beyond sort of political discourse or lobbying, although both are things that we engage in, to realize goals of the energy system change in both technical and social terms. So to say we want to focus on implementing renewable energy technologies, but we also want to focus on doing things a little differently by involving citizens in new ways. And I'm going to stop here so that we still have enough time for questions. One thing I do want to say, though, is everybody can join. So if you live in a city where unfortunately you cannot buy your own power grid at the moment, but you desperately want to, you can join us in buying the Berlin power grid. And you can also always connect with us if you want to share your experience in your home, or if you want to do something like that yourself, and we will help as much as we can to try and help you set up your own initiative.
Thank you very much, Arwen, for this presentation. And also, I think that's really a special case because grid is something that we do not hear that often. I mean, we hear about wind energy, for example, and solar energy, but grid is something very special. So thank you for your introduction and your presentation on this topic. Right now we can, we've reached like the discussion part, the interactive discussion with the topic, what are the successful financial models to facilitate cities in co-investments in the energy system? And yeah, I want to have like a small question for Arwen, actually, for clarifying. So the grid is now owned like by the city of Berlin, but the cooperative, what is the idea? Is the idea to transfer the rights to the cooperative, or what is the idea actually? How working together is meant in the future?
The idea is not to transfer the whole grid to the cooperative, but rather to sell shares to the cooperative, essentially. And there's different ways to realize this. And one of the easier ways, just in terms of organizing public ownership, is to have full municipalization and then include the cooperative as a partner in owning and managing the grid. Another idea would have been to say, well, once we buy back or once we assign the concession, we have a joint assignment to the public hand and the cooperative, but that's harder to realize for various reasons. One of them is that, and this is actually something that we discussed a lot in Berlin, is the cooperative is essentially a private company. And it's harder to say we want this to be a citizen-owned private partner rather than any private partner. And what happens very often is that you then have a municipality that sticks with the old grid operator and has a joint ownership with, for example, in our case, it would have been Vattenfall. And then you don't have citizens involved at all.
Mm-hmm. So what's then the role of the financing part of this? Like this, of course, citizens can buy shares, but obviously the project is already owned by the city.
You mean what the economic situation would be if we are included in ownership?
Yeah, for example, yeah, how important is like this like financing of this buying process?
Well, it's obviously a lot of money if you have a grid changing hands, and this is typically something that is also fought over a lot, because in Germany we have a weird system of ownership. So we have concessions. They assign the right to own and operate politically, and then you have an economic process where the old grid owner is forced to sell because of the concession to the new grid owner. So you have this economic part where you have to bring up the money to actually buy the grid. And so if we are involved, so now what happened was the municipality, the Landberlin, bought the whole grid from Vattenfall, has to bring up the whole sum of money. And if they sell shares to us, then we invest directly. We buy shares off of the Landberlin.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. That makes it clear, because we talk about co-investments, and my question is always, what is this co-investment and what does it mean actually? Maybe a question to Roger. So you mentioned the motivation of like the investors to buy, for example, electricity, to buy some solar PV panels. But what is actually the motivation of the rooftop or the roof owners to give like their roof? I mean, they could develop this on their own and have like their own panels on it. But what is for them that makes it so special that the roof owners actually then say, well, I want to use the service of Solarify? Can you still, is Roger still here? I think, or
did we lose Roger?
Did we lose him?
I think we lost him for a second.
I can talk about them because we do similar projects in Berlin, and I can maybe briefly talk about what the motivations of roof owners in Berlin are. So what we do in Berlin is called Mieterstrom. So the idea is to say, how do we get PV? How do we make PV accessible to people who rent their own home? Because that is very typical in Berlin. Most tenants are renters. And if you live in an apartment building that you don't own, then you don't, obviously it's much harder to get PV on your own roof. And we mostly work with cooperatives in the housing sector, because we then have this idea of saying, well, it's something that you own and make decisions over, both in the energy system and in the housing system. And the motivation of these cooperatives is very much sustainability driven, to say, well, we want to play our part. We see that this has to speed up. And it's also something, and I think that is quite unique actually, or quite specific to cooperatives, to say, well, it is our responsibility to take care of our members. And in that sense, it's also our responsibility to think about long-term developments that make sense to our members. And the motivation is typically not financial, although of course they do get paid. They get a rent for the roof from us, and it's a service in a sense that they can offer tenants something new, to say, well, you can now also have electricity from your own rooftop. But financial aspects really don't come up a lot. It's very much motivated by this idea of saying we want to contribute to the energy transition. And I actually think that is something that you see with a lot of co-investment projects, that there's a very strong sense of community, of sustainability, of saying, well, we should play our part in some way.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, that makes it clearer. I think there are many questions now also in the chat, and maybe Stefan, you can help me a little bit. And with this, I think you Okay, Roger is also back, so Roger is also good. Back, so good to know.
Sorry,
Yes.
my connections seem to be interrupted for for some minutes. Now it should be working here.
Yes, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So we've had a lively discussion in the chat with a couple of questions raised, but not only that, also people have already started to comment on the questions as they were being raised. We have a question from Felix Nipko, who asks on regulation for co-investment. In what regions do regulations exist that make it mandatory to have co-investment? Maybe we can pass that question. Who would like to answer that question?
So far, I know, I only know of such a regulation in France, where you actually have to co-finance a certain part of the installation, at least through a co-financing scheme, to actually also in Switzerland, I wouldn't know of such a regulation.
Yeah, I think what is a really interesting point that you raised in this respect is the question of how does that maybe differ in Switzerland with regard to the grid. So how are investments different if you're investing in renewable energy capacity rather than investing in distributional infrastructure? Because I know of various countries, and there was a discussion in the chat also about Denmark, for example, or Ireland, where they have or where they're introducing mandatory co-investments for citizens. And we have this discussion at the Bundesländer level in Germany. So we have certain Bundesländer, for example, Thuringia, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Schleswig-Holstein, that are requiring project managers to involve citizens in one way or another. But we don't have a mandatory regulation at the level of at the national level. And that is actually something that a lot of project developers are really really concerned about, because it doesn't, obviously there's no level playing field. And if you are proactive and you want to involve citizens, then that's at your own account. And it does involve more organizational contacts, and it does obviously muddy the waters of a project. So if you do it on your own account, then it makes life harder for you. And what would really interest me too is this question of how is that possible for the grid in Switzerland. I don't think municipal ownership should necessarily be a hurdle, because it's not the case in Germany. You can also switch from municipal management to cooperative management, or you can have a co-management situation with cooperatives or citizens investing in the infrastructure. And the question is, I think, not so much who owns the grid, but rather who governs grid ownership. So how is that organized in Switzerland? And I have to admit, I don't know. So how is it organized in Switzerland?
I think there's also a relating question, actually. Are there some examples in Switzerland of communities who support the network?
So yeah, as far as I know, like the grid situation in Switzerland is highly complicating, because we have, I think it's about 700 different utility companies managing the Swiss grid. And imagine the size of Switzerland, we're a small country, but 700 communities or electricity utility companies are involved into the grid management. And then in terms of ownership, most utility companies are state-owned, at least states or like municipal or cantonal or the national government owns parts of these utilities. So it's, in that sense, it's already kind of in the hands of the public, managed through those public entities. But I wouldn't know of any like initiatives like the one you have in Berlin that actually citizens could co-invest into the grid directly. It's more that you kind of pay tax money and your grid bill, and that's how the grid is then financed.
can see another question to Arwen. Like, do you see that EV mobility interest groups like Volkswagen and so on are interested to buy parts of the grid? Do you see that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting question. It's also interesting to say Volkswagen is an interest group. But I think it's a really good question because the business models associated with renewable energies are changing dramatically, not just because we have shifting or fluctuating supply. So we would be interested in prices that vary over time or vary with respect to the load in the grid, but also because we obviously have new actors entering the energy system through sector coupling, right? So heat, transport, those are all sectors that need to be electrified if we want to decarbonize them. We are seeing increasing interest from both automobile companies such as Volkswagen and also sort of related interest or lobby organizations in energy services. So this idea, for example, of tying a tariff to the EV because it's part of the value creation, right? And if you lose the motor, if you're no longer building the motor and you don't build the battery, because that is something that Germany just slept on, then gaining control of the tariff and the energy service is interesting, but not the grid so far. And also, I also highly doubt that they will be interested in the grid. I think they will rather much more be interested in extending their capacity for offering these kinds of services. And that relates more to grid management and intelligent services in the grid rather than grid ownership. And there's another question, right? How do you plan on involving all the private roof owners to install PV if they're not all part of the cooperative? If you're a roof owner, you don't have to become part of the cooperative to install PV installations. So the argument here is not so much to say everybody should be a member and then we will decarbonize the city, but rather to say there will have to be a lot more engagement with individual citizens by the grid operator than we have seen so far. So far, it's taking if you install a PV installation in Berlin, it's taking very long for it to be connected to the grid. It's very tedious. And the grid operator is not at all inviting on that behalf. And this is more a question that relates to, or for us, this is more something where we say we need to speed up the processes within the grid operator. We need to change dramatically how they interact with the community, because the fact that we have a system, an energy system that was predominantly shaped by large utilities also means that these utilities are not used to interacting with individual citizens. But that doesn't mean they have to become part of the cooperative. And but it rather means changing the way things are organized.
Thank you very much. And there's one question about the risk, and actually, Roger, that's something you mentioned, that there's, well, the FINMA is regulating, of course, some investments, but this crowdfunding is not regulated. And we see something similar in Germany, that this preferred mode of crowdfunding is also, there is, let's say, if they keep the investment rather low, like 25,000 euros, that's in Germany per person, in total 6 million, then this is also not so much regulated. But what does it mean in terms of risk? I mean, on the other hand, it allows us to reduce the amount of paperwork, but on the other hand, what about the risks that are maybe associated with something like this?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And I think it really depends on the crowdfunding business model you have. So every business model is associated with some benefits and some risks. For example, this model is offered by the utility companies. It's a model in which you actually kind of pre-purchase solar electricity from the utility company. So you kind of have this security that with your investment you get solar electricity, which is then discounted from your electricity bill. Financially speaking, that's not very lucrative. So most people then by a higher price in total if you kind of look at to what rates they actually discount your the electricity from your bills, and mostly what is discounted would have been cheaper than what you actually get. So in this sense, you cannot really lose money because it's not so much an investment logic behind this utility company models. So you just buy solar electricity at some price. Actually, in kind of when you look at the contracts that run behind these models, then in a cooperative, most cooperatives do not even pay dividends. So you just give this money out to the cooperative and let them operate with it. So it's kind of an enfant perdu investment. So if the wind or solar project fails, the cooperative fails, and the investors or the cooperative members, they've already given out their money, so they cannot lose much more than that. On the other side, our model, for example, and a couple of others, as you mentioned, it's an equity model, so people actually buy those solar panels. And as you said, ownership is already usually linked to some rights and duties, but also, as mentioned in the question, linked to some risks, because it's actually their panel. So if a project develops better than expected, the full benefit goes to them. But if a project turns out to be worse than expected, then this would also be kind of a risk of the investors. But we as a company, we can influence this risk and have different strategies in place to limit that risk. Because for us as a company, I think our reputation is what is of highest value, and kind of customers which would be very unhappy about their investment is one of the major risks for us as a company. So we have a very high incentive to manage the risk for our small scale investors as much as possible, and we have quite a broad variety of strategies how we can actually mitigate the risks of the small scale investors.
Thank you very much. We are coming close to 12 o'clock, but maybe there's that time for one short question. Do we have one more question, Stefan?
Yes, we do have one more question from Roman, who asks, what major challenge do you see for Solarify to build even more projects? So it's a question for Roger.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's our daily business to kind of find answers to that question. So as mentioned, our model works by combining roof owners with citizens that actually finance the installations. So on the roof owner side, it's also still a challenge sometimes to actually find enough partners which then can provide us with roof spaces. But in recent months, we've found quite some strategies or built some new partnerships which kind of decrease this issue, at least for the next couple of months, I'd say. On the roof side, it's also the whole technical challenge that the installation is actually viable, that we can run it profitably. And this highly depends on price levels, both on kind of the construction side, so actually module prices, the whole construction prices, but also electricity prices, so to which value can we then sell the electricity produced. So on the technical side, prices are growing at staggering rates at the moment, still a bit Corona related. So PV modules, they almost doubled in price in just 6 months, so that's a large challenge we face. But also for that, we're trying to find some strategies that we can secure prices at levels that are still manageable. But then on price sides, the development is highly interesting. So electricity prices on the spot market, they tripled in the same period. So the electricity produced can be sold at higher rates at the moment. So that's kind of the roof owner side. And on the other side now, we have so many different new projects at the moment. So the challenge is there to find enough small-scale investors which are willing to buy all those projects that we're offering at the moment. But also on that side, we have quite some different strategies, how we try to manage that. So I think long-term, our main challenge is to keep the roof owner sides and the small-scale investor side in balance, so that we can efficiently plan, finance, and implement our projects.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we are coming to the end now. Thank you very much to both Roger and Arwen for your really interesting insights, and both in presentation and later on also in the Q&A sessions. I personally really enjoyed it, and it gave me a new perspective on how, yeah, what we can do, like with co-investments, what can we do, and maybe also what can we not do, and also how can we use them successfully, and also how in these different areas like solar and grid, how it can be applied there, and what are the differences in terms of technology. That's a huge difference, which has also some effect on how we can use co-investments. Thank you very much. Now I want to invite everyone. Next week we have a new webinar coming up that is overcoming path dependence in firms' non-market activities. And I'm inviting you all to join this. And the webinar is now over. I will close the window in 2 minutes. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at another workshop. Thank you very much for everyone who attended, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.